James Bryant wasn't your average 7th grader at Lincoln West Middle School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. While most of his classmates spent their weekends glued to video games or scrolling through their phones, James was up at the crack of dawn, working alongside his father on their family farm. Farming wasn't just a job for the Bryants, it was a way of life, passed down through generations. Their farm, stretching across 150 acres of fertile Louisiana soil, produced everything from soybeans and corn to a small herd of cattle. James had grown up learning the land like the back of his hand. He knew how to read the sky to predict the weather, how to maintain irrigation systems, and how to use modern technology like GPS-guided tractors and soil sensors. While kids his age were memorizing science facts from a textbook, James was out in the field living them. To James, farming was more than just growing crops, it was about responsibility, hard work, and honoring his family's legacy. His grandfather, a retired Army veteran turned agricultural businessman, had built their farm into a thriving operation through years of sweat and smart decision-making. His father continued that tradition, and James took pride in knowing he was next in line. But none of that mattered when he walked into Mr. Bradley Whitmore's 7th grade science class. That day's lesson was on American agriculture, a topic James knew better than most. But as he skimmed the worksheet, he immediately spotted outdated information. Statements about small farms dying out, crop rotation being obsolete, and corporate agriculture taking over weren't just misleading, they were wrong. James had always been taught to stand by the truth. And as he raised his hand to correct his teacher, he had no idea that speaking up would lead to him being sent out of class, suspended from school, and ultimately, to his grandfather stepping in to make sure that no one, especially not a teacher, would dismiss the truth without consequences. It was a regular school day at Lincoln West Middle School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The bell had rung, and students settled into their seats, chatting about last night's football game or what was on the lunch menu. But for James Bryant, this wasn't just another lesson, it was personal. 7th grade science class that day focused on American agriculture, a subject James didn't just study, he lived. He had spent his childhood working the land, learning everything from soil rotation to advanced irrigation techniques. While his classmates read about farming in textbooks, James had spent years alongside his father and grandfather managing their 150-acre farm, using modern tools like GPS-guided tractors, drone technology, and soil sensors. As Mr. Bradley Whitmore, a stocky man in his mid-40s, passed out worksheets, he adjusted his glasses and began his lecture. Farming has changed drastically over the years, he announced. Traditional methods are becoming obsolete, most small farms are struggling, and corporate agriculture is taking over. James scanned the worksheet in front of him, and immediately, red flags popped up. The section on crop rotation. Completely outdated. The paragraph on irrigation. Missing key facts. And the claim that small farms were dying out. That wasn't true, his family's farm was living proof that small farmers were adapting, innovating, and thriving. He raised his hand. "That's not exactly true," he said. Mr. Whitmore turned, his expression tightening. "Excuse me. My family runs a farm," James said, sitting up straighter. "We use modern techniques, but we're still a small business. And crop rotation isn't outdated, it's actually more important now because of soil depletion." A few students turned to look at him. Some smirked. Others whispered. Mr. Whitmore let out a short laugh. "James, I appreciate your input," he said, "but I think I'll trust the experts who wrote the textbook." James frowned. "But the textbook is wrong." The room went silent. James wasn't trying to be disrespectful, he had always been taught that when you know the truth, you don't stay quiet. "We use precision farming," he continued. "Drones, soil sensors, GPS technology. Small farms aren't just surviving, they're innovating. The silence thickened. Mr. Whitmore slowly set his textbook down. James, this class follows the curriculum. If you have concerns, you can discuss them after class. James clenched his jaw. But you're teaching us the wrong information. A few kids chuckled under their breath. Mr. Whitmore's face darkened. That's enough, he said, his voice sharp. Take your worksheet and complete the assignment. James didn't back down. So we're just supposed to copy wrong answers. The tension in the room was suffocating. Mr. Whitmore's voice dropped to a cold, clipped tone. You're being disruptive. If you can't respect this class, you can leave. James' heart pounded. I'm just telling the truth. That was it. Office. Now. Gasps rippled through the room. James felt his hands curl into fists as he grabbed his backpack. The stares of his classmates burned into his back as he walked out the door. His chest was tight with frustration, but he had no idea this was only the beginning. James Bryant walked down the hallway, his sneakers squeaking against the polished tile floor. His chest was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't the kind of kid who talked back to teachers or looked for a fight. But he also wasn't the kind of kid to sit there and let someone tell him something he knew wasn't true. When he arrived at the front office, the school secretary, Mrs. Dunbar, barely glanced up from her desk. A middle-aged woman with tightly curled hair and sharp eyes, she had been working at Lincoln West Middle School long enough to know when a student was in real trouble, and when the whole situation smelled off. Mr. Whitmore already called, she said, pointing at a chair near the principal's door. Have a seat. James dropped into the chair, his knee bouncing as he replayed the classroom confrontation in his mind. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't been rude. He had simply corrected the lesson with facts he knew firsthand. Was that really worth being kicked out of class? Minutes later, the office door creaked open, and Principal Harold Easton, a gray-haired man with deep lines on his face, gestured for James to step inside. The office smelled of old books and lemon-scented cleaner. Easton sat down with a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as if he already knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. James, he said, his voice tired, tell me what happened. James straightened in his chair. I corrected Mr. Whitmore in class. He said I was being disruptive. Easton studied him. Did you raise your voice? No. Did you keep arguing after he asked you to stop? I just told him the textbook was wrong, James answered firmly. Because it is. My family farms, and we. Easton held up a hand. I'm not saying you're wrong, but in a classroom setting, you have to respect the teacher's authority. James' jaw tightened. Even when he's wrong. The principal hesitated. There's a time and place for those discussions, he finally said. Maybe you could have asked him after class. James shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. He laughed at me. Before Easton could respond, the door opened again, and Mr. Whitmore stepped inside. His arms were crossed, his expression tense. I see we're still discussing this, he muttered. Easton leaned back in his chair. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to find a way to resolve this without disciplinary action. James says he wasn't being disrespectful, just correcting inaccurate information. Mr. Whitmore's face darkened. This isn't about whether he was right or wrong, it's about following classroom rules. I gave him an instruction, and he ignored it. James swallowed, forcing down his frustration. You didn't answer my question. You just wanted me to stop talking. Whitmore's lips twitched. Watch your tone, young man. Principal Easton rubbed his chin. "Mr. Whitmore, is this really worth suspension?" James' heart pounded. Suspension? Whitmore hesitated before replying, "I think a firm consequence is needed." Easton exhaled slowly and nodded. "James, I'm sending you home for the rest of the day. We'll discuss further action tomorrow." James' stomach sank. "That's not fair." Easton raised a hand. "It's not about fair, James. It's about structure." James stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He knew there was no point in arguing. The school secretary called his mother, and 20 minutes later, Tasha Bryant arrived. Her face was unreadable, but James knew that look. It wasn't anger, it was worse. Disappointment. Principal Easton explained the situation, and by the time they walked out of the office, his mother's silence felt heavier than words. The ride home from Lincoln West Middle School was silent. James Bryant sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window as the Louisiana countryside blurred past. His mother, Tasha Bryant, gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. She had left work in the middle of the day to pick him up, and her silence was heavy. It wasn't anger. James knew that much. It was something worse, disappointment. "You want to explain why I had to leave work for this?" she finally asked, her voice calm but firm. James kept his gaze outside. "I told the truth." Tasha let out a slow breath. "You could have told the truth after class." James shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. His mother didn't argue, and that was almost more unsettling than if she had. Instead, she drove the rest of the way in silence, pulling into the long dirt driveway of their family farm. As the truck rumbled to a stop in front of the farmhouse, James spotted his father, Terrence Bryant, standing outside. He was a big man, broad shoulders, rough hands from years of working the land, and the kind of presence that made people think twice before crossing him. Terrence didn't say a word at first, just studied his son with a gaze that made James shift on his feet. Finally, he looked at Tasha. "What happened?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "They suspended him. Said they'll discuss further action tomorrow." Terrence's jaw tightened. "For what?" Tasha folded her arms. "For correcting a teacher." Terrence let out a sharp breath through his nose. "So we're punishing kids for knowing more than their teachers now?" James felt some of the weight in his chest lift. At least his dad was on his side. "I'll handle it," Terrence muttered, already turning toward the house. But before he could take another step, a deep voice rumbled from the porch. "No," the voice said. "I will." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, his 6'4" frame casting a long shadow against the late afternoon sun, was Ezekiel Bryant. James' grandfather was a man who didn't waste words. A retired military veteran, Ezekiel had built his fortune through smart land investments, turning the family's farm into an empire. People in town respected him. Some feared him. Not because he was violent, but because he was a man who never let disrespect slide. His silver beard was trimmed sharp, his dark jeans pressed, and his boots polished. Even at his age, Ezekiel Bryant carried himself like a man in command. "They sent my grandson home like he's some kind of delinquent?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Tasha nodded. Principal Easton said James was being disruptive. Ezekiel let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Disruptive," he repeated, like the word itself was an insult. He turned his sharp gaze to James. "Boy, did you cuss that man out?" James straightened. "No, sir." "Did you throw a fit? Slam a desk? Walk out of class?" "No, sir." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. Then what did you do? I told him the textbook was wrong, James said, his voice steady. Because it is. A slow smirk pulled at the corner of Ezekiel's mouth. Good. James blinked. Good. Ezekiel stepped down from the porch, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. You stood your ground, he said simply. You didn't back down when you knew you were right. James felt his chest swell with something he hadn't felt all day, pride. Terence exhaled, running a hand over his beard. So what now? Ezekiel's smirk widened. Now, he said, we send a message. Tasha sighed, already pinching the bridge of her nose. Daddy, please don't turn this into a spectacle. Ezekiel turned to her, his expression unreadable. You want your son to learn to keep his mouth shut when he knows he's right? Tasha hesitated. Ezekiel nodded. Didn't think so. With that, he turned and walked back toward the house like he had already made up his mind. James' pulse quickened. Whatever his grandfather was planning, it wasn't going to be small. And by tomorrow morning, nobody at Lincoln West Middle School would forget the name Ezekiel Bryant. The next morning, James Bryant sat at the kitchen table, barely touching his breakfast. His mother paced the kitchen, phone in hand, shaking her head. I don't understand how this got so out of hand, she muttered. Why are they acting like he committed a crime? His father, Terence Bryant, sat at the table, sipping his coffee, his face unreadable. Because some people don't like being challenged. At the head of the table, Ezekiel Bryant calmly cut into his eggs, as if this was just another morning. Then, without looking up, he said, James, put on a clean shirt. You're coming with me. James blinked. Where? His grandfather finally looked up, a slow smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. To school. Before James could ask any more questions, he heard it, a deep, distant rumble that made the windows tremble. His father put down his coffee. Zeke, he warned. Ezekiel pushed back his chair and stood. I told you, I'm handling it. James rushed to the front door and threw it open just in time to see a sleek black helicopter cutting through the sky. His breath caught as the aircraft descended, kicking up dust as it hovered over the family's field. The powerful blades whipped through the air, sending leaves flying and making the horses in the distance stir. James turned to his grandfather, eyes wide. We're taking that? Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, adjusting his cufflinks. I told you, boy, we're sending a message. His mother groaned, pinching the bridge of her nose. Daddy, is this really necessary? Ezekiel glanced at her. You want your son to learn to keep his mouth shut when he knows he's right? She hesitated. Ezekiel nodded. Didn't think so. With that, he walked toward the helicopter like it was just another day, the pilot already waiting with the door open. James didn't hesitate, he followed his grandfather and climbed inside. The moment he buckled in, the engine roared, and the ground disappeared beneath them. His stomach flipped, but he barely noticed. Because today, they weren't just showing up to school. They were making an entrance. At Lincoln West Middle School, Principal Harold Easton was already having a bad morning. He had barely taken a sip of his coffee when his secretary, Mrs. Dunbar, rushed in, her face pale. Sir, she stammered. What is it, Mrs. Dunbar? She hesitated before blurting out, there's a helicopter landing on the football field. Easton blinked. Excuse me. But before she could repeat herself, a deep, rhythmic vibration filled the air. Books on his shelves trembled. The windows rattled. Easton shot up from his chair and rushed to the window. What he saw made his breath hitch. Right in the middle of the football field, a black helicopter was touching down, kicking up dirt and grass. And stepping out, moving like he owned the place, was Ezekiel Bryant. The helicopter's blade slowed, but the impact was already made. Students flooded the hallways, pressing against the windows, their mouths hanging open. Some pulled out their phones, recording as the 6'4" figure of Ezekiel Bryant stepped onto the field, his polished boots crunching against the grass. Behind him, James followed, gripping his backpack, trying to process what was happening. From inside the building, teachers peeked through their blinds, whispering. Some students gasped. Others laughed in disbelief. One kid muttered, "Yo, is that your grandpa?" James barely nodded. Security guards rushed toward the field, but Ezekiel didn't even slow his stride. Principal Easton stormed outside, his face red, his tie slightly loosened. He looked like a man who already regretted his morning. "Mr. Bryant, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded over the dying roar of the helicopter. Ezekiel adjusted his sleeves, speaking with the same unshaken calm he always had. "The meaning?" he echoed. "The meaning is my grandson was kicked out of this school for knowing more than the man teaching him. And that doesn't sit right with me." Easton ran a hand down his face, clearly thrown off. "Look, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Ezekiel chuckled. "Son, I don't get upset. I get answers." James watched, stunned, as his grandfather walked straight past the principal toward the main entrance of the school, like he belonged there. The security guards looked at Easton for instruction, but Easton hesitated. There was something about Ezekiel Bryant that made people second-guess themselves. Power. Authority. A man who didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. "Mr. Bryant," Easton called after him, jogging to catch up. "You can't just walk in here unannounced." Ezekiel stopped just before the doors and turned, his gaze sharp. "Unannounced," he repeated. "Your school had no problem throwing my grandson out without a fair discussion. So consider this my way of announcing that I'd like one." James bit the inside of his cheek. His grandfather didn't yell. He didn't need to. Every word landed heavier because of it. Easton exhaled through his nose. "Fine. We can talk." Then he gestured toward the helicopter. "But this spectacle." Ezekiel smiled. "See, that's where we disagree." By now, the entire school was watching, from the second-floor windows to the cafeteria doors. Students and staff peeked out, whispering, texting, recording. And just like that, the principal had no choice but to let them inside. Because Ezekiel Bryant wasn't asking anymore. Inside the principal's office, the air felt heavier than usual. James Bryant sat beside his grandfather, Ezekiel Bryant, across from Principal Harold Easton's desk. Mr. Whitmore stood near the filing cabinets, arms crossed, his expression tight. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, tapping the armrest with a single finger. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and everyone in the room knew it. "I want to hear it from him," Ezekiel said, nodding toward Mr. Whitmore. "Tell me why you kicked my grandson out of class." Whitmore straightened his posture. "Mr. Bryant, this isn't personal." James was disrupting the lesson. "I asked him to follow instructions, and he refused." Ezekiel tilted his head. "So let me get this straight, a child corrects false information in your lesson, and instead of encouraging discussion, you punish him?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. It wasn't the time or place. Ezekiel leaned forward slightly. "Then when is?" "Because I was under the impression that school was where kids learn." The room fell silent. James swallowed hard. He had never seen a teacher struggle for words before. Whitmore cleared his throat. Regardless, James' behavior was inappropriate. Ezekiel let out a low chuckle. Inappropriate, he repeated. He tapped the desk once. Boy, I served in the military. I know what inappropriate looks like. A kid correcting a teacher. That ain't it. Principal Easton cleared his throat. Mr. Bryant, we can discuss this rationally. Oh, I am rational, Ezekiel interrupted. That's why I came here first instead of going to the school board. Or calling the local news. Or, he glanced at James, letting this go viral on social media. Easton flinched. Because he knew, that if this story got out, it wouldn't just be about James anymore. And Ezekiel Bryant wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just a visit. This was a warning. The room felt smaller, more suffocating. Ezekiel sat back, one leg crossed over the other, completely at ease. James, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his fists clenched in his lap. Across from them, Mr. Whitmore looked like he had swallowed something bitter. Principal Easton adjusted his tie, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Bryant, I want to resolve this. What exactly are you asking for? Ezekiel exhaled through his nose. First, he said, raising one finger, James goes back to class today. No mark on his record. Easton nodded slowly. We can arrange that. Ezekiel raised a second finger. Second, he gets a formal apology from you and Mr. Whitmore. James' breath hitched. An apology? From a teacher? Whitmore's face twisted. That's unnecessary. Ezekiel shrugged. Then I'll have to get in touch with the school board. I have friends there, you know. Might even call a few local reporters. He tilted his head. You ever seen what happens when a school tries to silence a black student who's just telling the truth? Easton stiffened. Whitmore's throat bobbed as he swallowed. James swore he could hear the gears turning in their heads. Ezekiel was giving them a choice, but not really. Either they did the right thing now, quietly, or they did it later, under public pressure. Whitmore looked at Easton. Then at Ezekiel. Then, reluctantly, he sighed. Fine. Ezekiel turned to Easton expectantly. The principal adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. James, he said, his voice forced, we shouldn't have rushed to judgment. I apologize. James sat frozen. He didn't know if he was in shock or just waiting for someone to tell him he was dreaming. Then, slowly, Whitmore exhaled, his hands clenched like it physically pained him to do what he was about to do. James, he said through gritted teeth, I'm sorry. James didn't say anything. Not because he couldn't. But because for the first time, he didn't have to. Ezekiel clapped his hands together. Good. Now that we've settled that. He stood, towering over the desk. I'll be keeping an eye on this school. If anything like this happens again, he let the sentence hang. Principal Easton's brows pulled together. Is that a threat? Ezekiel grinned. Nah. He adjusted his cufflinks. It's a promise. James grabbed his backpack as his grandfather turned to him. Come on, boy. Let's get you back to class. And just like that, the meeting was over. As James walked down the hallway, every pair of eyes was on him. Students whispered. Some nodded in approval. Others just stared. James wasn't sure if they saw him differently now, if they looked at him with respect or just shock. But honestly, he didn't care. Because when he stepped into the classroom, Mr. Whitmore barely looked at him. And for the first time ever, James took his seat, knowing he had won. That afternoon, the black helicopter lifted off once again, cutting through the Louisiana sky. James Bryant stood outside the school with his grandfather, watching as the blades sliced through the air. The school parking lot was still half full, but he knew that by tomorrow, the entire town would be talking. Ezekiel Bryant adjusted his sleeves and glanced at his grandson. "So," he said, "what did you learn today?" James thought about it. About how he had been ready to fight with words, how he had thought the only way to be heard was to argue louder. But his grandfather had shown him something different. Power wasn't just about being right. It was about knowing when to make people listen. James smirked. "That when people underestimate you, it's their mistake, not yours." Ezekiel chuckled. "Smart boy." They stood there in silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Then Ezekiel clapped a hand on James' shoulder. "Next time, though, tell me before you get yourself kicked out of school." James laughed. "No promises." But as the helicopter disappeared into the clouds, James realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was about every kid who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Every kid who knew something the world didn't want to hear. And today, for all of them, he had made sure they did. By the next morning, news of the confrontation had spread like wildfire. Students whispered in the hallways. Teachers avoided eye contact. Even Principal Easton seemed more reserved. When James walked into class, Mr. Whitmore barely acknowledged him. And for the first time ever, James took his seat knowing that he had won. The lesson continued, but something had changed. James wasn't just another student anymore. He was proof. Proof that sometimes, standing your ground means shaking the whole system. He didn't have to yell. He didn't have to argue. He just had to know his truth, and make sure the right people listened. That night at dinner, as his mother set a plate of cornbread on the table, she sighed. "I still don't know if all that was necessary." Ezekiel chuckled as he buttered his biscuit. "Oh, it was necessary." His father nodded. "Some people don't change until you make them." James sat quietly, thinking about everything that had happened. About how he had nearly lost his voice in that classroom. About how easily his words could have been dismissed. But they weren't. Not because he had fought harder. But because his grandfather had made sure he didn't have to fight alone. The next time James found himself in a situation where he knew he was right, he wouldn't hesitate. Because knowledge wasn't just power. It was a weapon. And the smartest people, they knew exactly when to use it. In life, there will always be moments when speaking the truth comes at a cost. Whether it's in a classroom, a workplace, or even within our own families, standing up for what's right isn't always easy. Sometimes, people in authority dismiss facts not because they are right, but because they don't want to be challenged. That's why knowing when and how to make your voice heard is just as important as knowing the truth itself. For James Bryant, the lesson wasn't just about agriculture. It was about integrity. It was about the courage to speak up, even when it was easier to stay quiet. But what made the real difference wasn't just his conviction, it was having someone in his corner who made sure his words carried weight. That's a lesson many of us learn later in life. The fight for truth is not always won alone. Sometimes, it takes wisdom, experience, and the right kind of presence to ensure that the truth isn't ignored. Ezekiel Bryant knew that power isn't about shouting the loudest, it's about knowing when and where to apply pressure. And that's something we can all carry into our own lives. Whether it's advocating for ourselves, our children, or even our grandchildren, we must remember that knowledge is more than just power, it's influence. The world changes when people refuse to let lies stand unchallenged. But even more importantly, it changes when those who have walked life's longer road use their wisdom to make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight alone. So, the next time you see someone younger struggling to be heard, ask yourself, can your presence turn their truth into something that must be acknowledged? Because sometimes, the greatest thing we can do is stand beside someone and make sure the world listens.